Good morning and welcome to the virtual Houston Techfest. Before we start, I want to make you aware about a feature in the presentation that will make the session more interactive. Please make note of the question mark icon at the upper right of the presentation screen. Clicking that icon will open the question and answer feature, which allows our audience members to send the moderator questions to be delivered to our presenters at the appropriate time. We are proud to present Christine and William Asif, who will be sharing ethics in modern data. Christine and William, the floor is all yours.
Great, thank you. Hi, and welcome to Ethics in Modern Data. My name is Christine Asif.
I'm William Asif.
And today we're going to talk about bias, transparency, and the impact of ethics in modern data. So first, a little bit about me. I am a people solutions consultant. I have 15 years of experience in human resources professional. I'm also in IO psychology. I'm a current grad student in IO psychology. And if you don't know what IO is, I heard William saying IO, I think it's a SQL term too. It stands for Industrial Organizational Psychology, which is basically the study of people and behaviors in the workplace. So I like to study that right now. And then also I'm a frequent speaker, trainer, and writer in various applications, as well as Houston Techfest and SQL Saturdays across the United States.
I'm William Asif. I'm a Microsoft Data Platform MVP, and I'm a principal consultant at Sparkhound, which is a consulting company. I'm a DBA. I work in data all day long. Also the author of the SQL Server Inside Out books by Microsoft Press for the past couple of generations, and with Professional Association for SQL Server, I'm a regional mentor. Today we're going to be talking about ethics in data and bias. Talking about bias in data collection and data analytics. What we can do to recognize our own bias and fight the perception of bias, and on how bias in data has real impacts on our society. But without context, without understanding historical or time-based biases, we both find we and our data findings are doomed to just parrot that bias. We understand this is an international audience, so one thing to keep in mind is that we are from the United States, and many but not all of our examples are based in United States history. We will try to be as expository as possible when setting the context here, but if you have any questions, we are open to requested clarifications at the end of the presentation. We've already made the slides available. The recording will be available at houstontechfest.com, and you'll find references to all of our sources at the bottoms of each slide. This is one of my favorite webcomic series from Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal, with a take on why the robot uprising used spears and rocks.
If trained on data, which contains human bias, then of course our data outcomes will learn bias. Worse, they're likely to amplify it, institutionalize it, and mask it in the trustworthiness of an algorithm. Laura Douglas, an AI researcher, defines bias as an inaccuracy which is systematically incorrect in the same direction. Many algorithms, which are trained to do a human job, will have been trained on human-generated data. This is a huge problem, especially if people assume that the algorithms are impartial and can't hold the same biases as people do. This presentation is about acknowledging both the public's perception of the trustworthiness of statistical analysis and also our responsibilities as data professionals and analysts. And this presentation is about our ethical responsibilities as data professionals to become aware of bias, to acknowledge it, and to be accountable for it. So here's an example of bias. This is from Google Translate. So you see here, he is nurse and she is doctor. But reverse the translation and the gendered language is reversed and the gender norms are now reinforced. Now we see that she's a nurse and he's a doctor. Biases are live on display in the wild. You can try this with yourself with a number of languages. This works for Hungarian and Turkish to English. This is only helping to further society's implicit biases that already exist, in this case, gender norms on profession. Without awareness of historical bias in source data, you will present unethical findings at best. Bias exists. It must be identified and acknowledged. Conclusions drawn on biased data without caveats, statistical controls, or any historical context may be highly unethical. So let's look at more examples of that.
So our first example discusses Major League Baseball. Widespread use of steroids in the late 90s and early 2000s set many new home run records. There was a significant increase in players who hit more than 40 home runs in a single season during the steroid era compared to before and after. Though steroids were banned in Major League Baseball in 1991, the league did not implement league-wide testing until 2003. The top 6 home run single season records in history are all between 1998 and 2001, all by 3 players you probably recognize: Barry Bonds, Mark McGwire, and Sammy Sosa. This knowledge of their illegal actions affects our historical analysis of training techniques, scouting, coaching, Hall of Fame eligibility, long-term player health, player compensation, or even the batting statistics of stadiums. We must ethically consider the player behavior during the legal and unmonitored steroid use era in baseball. So, okay, that was a softball. Let's dive into a more difficult subject. In the United States, Comstock laws, in effect from 1873 to 1957, had a widespread and lasting cultural impact, banning, quote, obscene, lewd, or lascivious materials. Mid-20th century libraries experienced cultural censorship of racism, sexism, nudity, religion, and evolution. In fact, the American Library Association in 1984, quote, discerned a continuing pattern of suppression of information from the government. The 1980s and the Reagan era ushered in a new push to libraries, school boards, and government agencies to censor books. And the media almost invariably yield to pressure and establish some sort of code of self-regulation and a sense of self-preservation. This knowledge affects our analysis of book publication sales, readership, popularity, public sentiment, and sociological trends. Even trademark conversations must be aware of, quote, censorship placed on the industry from religious groups, patriots, unions, and private businesses. And of course, the government. Just because publications weren't sold or available doesn't mean the publications didn't exist or that there wasn't public interest in them. And by the way, those same Comstock laws also prohibited the mailing and sale of contraceptives. And it was not until 1972 that the United States Supreme Court legalized birth control for all citizens, regardless of marital status. This knowledge affects our historical data sources on all sorts of American data, like birth rates, reproductive health history, family planning choices, family size preference, foreign aid, and even public health policy. Next example, there is significant historical and modern day evidence for race-based bias in federal judicial sentencing. A 1992 review revealed both ethnic and gender biases in sentencing where judges have discretion, and no biases where discretion was limited. Another study in 2014 found that sentences for Black males in the federal system are nearly 20% longer than those for white males convicted of similar crimes. The data speaks to 2 different potential causes. First, the Supreme Court case United States versus Booker in 2005 and Gall versus United States in 2007 gave federal judges more discretion on sentencing. And second, studies have found bias in prosecutorial discretion, that is, in decisions on who to charge and with what severity of charges. Bias in both sentencing discretion by judges and prosecutorial discretion by attorneys general contribute to outcomes resulting in racial disparities in our criminal justice system. Perhaps accounting for a judge's discretion, quote, charges with mandatory minimums are disproportionately charged against Black defendants. Analysis of severity and length of sentencing, acquittals, prosecutorial effectiveness, evidence collection, interrogation techniques all must take into account biased outcomes on race. Analysis without this historical context would only reinforce and institutionalize historical racial bias. Drawing conclusions from this data without the context of legal racial segregation and discrimination in the early parts of the 20th century in the United States would be highly unethical.
So how do we go about identifying and overcoming any bias? Data collection is usually provided to us through real-world interactions, which means that it may contain real-world bias. No data exists in a vacuum. Understand that bias in data collection and analysis may be inevitable, but it's not acceptable. It's not your responsibility to end bias, though that's a worthy cause, but rather to be aware of it. You have an ethical responsibility to acknowledge, control for, and not further bias. Look at bias outcomes, not their intents or origins. Outcomes are how bias is measured. The world really doesn't care whether we intended to be unbiased. It cares whether or not we were biased. So it's really all about the outcome. So part of our ethical responsibility is looking at our methodologies and processes with data and knowing that its statistical accuracy and its inaccuracy. So let's look at some statistics 101. And first, we'll start off with just basic, simple phrases like what is validity and what is reliability. Validity is the extent to which a concept, a conclusion, or a measurement is well-founded, and it likely corresponds to something accurate in the real world. Valid derives from Latin to mean strong, which basically means we're pretty sure this is not made up. It actually exists out there. It tells a story of something true. But more importantly, validity means we sought out to answer a question, to hit the bullseye. And we're pretty sure that this data, this system, this analysis answers that real world question. Now, reliability is all about consistency. We can do this test, we can run this system, we can predict that this thing is happening over and over and over again. We know it to be true. Basically, we have confidence in the results of this. So how do we prove what we've gathered is valid and reliable? Through hypothesis testing. Typically, that means we formulate a hypothesis, we collect the data, analyze the data to test the hypothesis, and then we draw our conclusions. But if our data is skewed, our analysis will also be skewed, and then we may draw incorrect conclusions. To put another way, if our collection methods lack credibility and our analysis fails to see all the variables that are in our data, then can we truly say that our data was valid or reliable? How can we overcome something that we don't know? Excuse me. Well, there's a few ways. The first is independent verification by consultants or other business entities, subject matter experts, outside perspectives, third-party analysis, or simply by putting more diversity of thought into our analysis, which means including people on our teams who may have different life experiences than our own, who can give us insights into variables that maybe we have missed. And we're going to talk more about that in just a second. So Brad Smith with Microsoft once wrote, "It's difficult to build technology that serves the world without first building a team that reflects the diversity of that world. A more diverse group of researchers and engineers is more likely to recognize and think harder about bias problems that may even impact them personally." In IT, we know we need complex teams to solve complex problems. We know diverse teams are more productive. So let's look at some examples of bias. So this isn't the first time we're going to mention facial recognition products in this presentation. In January of this past year, 2020, in the United Kingdom, 81% of people identified as suspects by the Metropolitan Police, their facial recognition technology, they were identified by that, were in fact innocent. They were innocent. Also, this same technology falsely identified African American and Asian faces 10 to 100 times more than Caucasian faces. And in 2018, a test of Amazon's recognition computer vision platform, 28 members of the US Congress were incorrectly matched as other people who have been arrested for a crime. So without validity or reliability, is it ethical to use facial recognition technology that has pervasive access to public camera systems? I would say no. And do we think that law enforcement will be transparent and open about the flaws of such a system? I would say no again. So now let's talk more about the need for transparency. So many Americans are familiar with the ACT test. And this is an exam that many 18-year-olds take part of, for the college application process. ACT has long since stated that the test measures what students learned in school, which means that they think it's valid, and that repeated testing, if a student takes it over and over and over again, they're going to get similar results, which means that it's reliable. However, in 2016, ACT admitted that family income is a major factor on their test. There is a 3 to 4 point difference between students in poorer and richer households, and that line being around $80,000 per year in household. And that gap is widening according to their own data. Credit to ACT for disclosing the research here, which shows that widening gap among students for family income. And later, they tried to explain this gap by indicating that lower income students also had lower high school GPAs, had less rigorous coursework. And again, credit to them for at least acknowledging this. But is ACT ethically testing for high school achievement or more for opportunity? If our measurements are valid and reliable, but our outcomes are rejected, should we challenge our testing? Our results are valid as tested, but what about the outcomes? Are they ethical? And are they to be trusted as a result of an impartial algorithm? In this ACT example, socioeconomic level is a variable and it affects the outcome. There are other variables that could affect the student's ACT score as well, such as tutoring, homeschooled versus public schooled versus private schooled, the number of miles that they're away from a large city, the amount of sleep the student got before the exam, whether they're male or female, or if the kid has a part-time job that they work and the number of hours that they work in that part-time job. So recently, more than 1,000 institutions of higher learning have adopted test optional admission policies, meaning that they no longer ask for the ACT or the SAT on applications. This might question the validity of ACT's test in terms of what colleges want out of that score, given that so many schools are now disregarding its validity. An overwhelming amount of studies that have been done say that the ACT does not predict college graduation outcomes. In fact, the biggest factor, the bigger factor that impacts graduation outcome remains household income. So we should just toss out that test and just accept students that have higher household incomes, right? That's sarcasm. So knowing the variables that are involved in your analysis is important, just as we saw with the ACT. When conducting analysis, most researchers will review, identify, and map out the variables. So let's briefly go through some definitions of variables, and then I promise I'm going to give you an example that's going to make this clearer, okay? So first, understand that mediators and confounders are similar, except they affect the direction on which they have on the exposure or the outcome. Mediators are considered to be the causal pathway between exposure and outcome, which means that they seem to kind of naturally occur. Confounders directly affect both the exposure and the outcome. And then moderators are simply interactions that change the size and direction of the effect of the exposure on the outcome. Basically, it makes the outcome either smaller or larger. And covariates are variables that might affect the outcomes, but they really aren't associated with anything else. You will never find the variables unless you're looking for them. You have to ask yourself a lot of questions. You have to ask yourself, are there any other variables that affect this data? Is there anything that I'm missing? There will always be other variables made apparent when you dig, when you scratch that surface. And sometimes you'll never see them until your data collection is actually complete. So now let's look at an example. So we're going to look at the relationship between poor mothers, shown here as maternal deprivation, and low birth weight. So we know this to be true, that maternal deprivation or poor mothers tend to give birth to babies with lower birth rate. It's just true. It's been tested over and over again. This is based on a study actually to investigate trends in birth rates in socioeconomic deprivation and maternal age in England. And this was from 1997 to 2008. But why? Why do we see this trend? What are the variables surround it? So let's look at those variables. So first, mediator here is diet. Remember, mediator was that causal pathway. It's said to be naturally occurring. In this case, diet could be just due to being poor. And a suboptimal diet of a mother who is nourishing an unborn child means that that baby is going to be smaller. Usually, a mediator variable is something that you can't avoid in your data. It just exists and you need to be aware of it. The confounder variable here is age. And remember that confounders affect both the exposure, the poor mothers, as well as the outcome, low birth rate. And in our analysis, maternal age may affect poverty. Perhaps the younger the mother is, the less money she has, or she could just be physically less developed than an older adult woman. And therefore her age may be associated with low birth weight and maternal deprivation. This variable could be controlled for, though. We could ask for only mothers of certain ages. Now, remember, the moderator affects the size or the direction of our outcome. In this case, the moderator is smoking. Now, there's an interaction between poor mothers and smoke exposure on birth weight, meaning that poor mothers tend to smoke, which produces babies that are even smaller. And again, we could control for this if we wanted to. We could look at data for mothers who don't smoke or only for those who do. And then lastly, our covariate here is height. Now remember that this variable is for things that we need to account for because we think they're related to our outcome, but they're not really connected to anything else. Height here could be a factor, but it doesn't affect the exposure, but maybe the outcome. And again, this would be a variable we could control for. We could say that we only want mothers of a certain height or between a certain height range, but we may or may not be able to in our data collection. And this brings up a great point. When presented with data, you may or may not have the ability to control for your variables. Can you remove some variables and not others? And how do you choose which variables to account for? And then what's the reasoning behind those decisions? Clearly describing where we think or predict the interactions, the relationships, the pathways that exist in our data and our work is incredibly powerful. And mapping and reviewing and analyzing our data for all the variables that could exist that could bias our data can help us in mitigating that bias.
So let's talk about transparency as part of overcoming bias. Here's an example in the United States where political pollsters may have altered their data to fit the competition. In a study by the website 538, non-traditional pollsters like online surveys or automated systems were allegedly cheating by peaking at a gold standard poll. Now, in political polling, a gold standard poll is a live phone call survey. Non-traditional political polls are mysteriously more accurate when there is a gold standard poll in the same election, and less accurate when there has not been a gold standard poll done in that election. So when there was a gold standard poll, the non-traditional polls were more accurate, but in a small election in Alaska where there's no gold standard phone poll done, the non-traditional polls were less accurate. Our picture here is of the crosstabs in a political poll, a detailed data table of polling results by demographic breakdown per question. A common response to big or sensational headlines about political poll results should always be, show me the crosstabs. Transparency should include not only the crosstabs of your results, but a disclosure and discussion of known historical biases. Your data tells a story. There may be a tendency to want to manipulate the data to fit the story you want to tell. How can you show the crosstabs, show the detail and the proof in your work?
So this is a quote from an NIH study. Every scientist should therefore be aware of all potential sources of bias. If deviation is still present, authors should confess it in their articles by declaring the known limitations of their work. Essentially, failure to provide transparency begs accusations of biased interpretation. So let's look at an example with biased outcomes and no transparency. In 2009, Apple issued credit cards and men were given higher credit limits than women, even higher than their wives. How could this be? Could potentially women's income inequality be a variable? Women's income inequality provides a historically biased look at gender. And a quote from Wired magazine said, "No one from Apple seemed to be able to describe how the algorithm even worked, let alone justify its output." While Goldman Sachs, the issuing bank for Apple Card, insisted that there isn't any gender bias in their algorithm, it failed to offer proof. This is an example of Apple not even being aware of their bias, much less disclosing it publicly, which would have been embarrassing. And now Apple is being investigated by regulators, so these kind of errors may result in legal implications. One could be challenged on disparate impact, particularly in employment areas, and we're going to talk about disparate impact a bit later. You need to be able to support your conclusions. That's why we're talking about steroids and censorship and race and facial recognition and the Apple cards. Transparency to how the algorithm works, at least internally, in the case of competitive intellectual property, is key to acknowledging bias in outcomes.
So let's dive deeper into this ethical problem. We've talked about transparency in analysis. Let's talk about ethics in data collection. So this is from a report from the White House in 2014. Keys here are that 1, data will be collected on individuals, and 2, data will not be owned by those individuals. What are our ethical responsibilities in collection and ownership of citizens' data? Let's go over a couple of bad examples. You may be familiar with a story from American retailer Target's direct mail campaign for expectant mothers and a furious dad who didn't know his teenage daughter was pregnant. This quote is from Andrew Pohl, the Target statistician who developed the store's model for predicting and detecting consumer pregnancies, which were then used to target ads at expectant mothers. We are very conservative about compliance with all privacy laws, but even when you're following the law, you can do things where people get queasy. Ethical collection, unethical use, resulting in a violation of privacy for a very sensitive topic. What if this ad arrived shortly after a miscarriage? It'd be different if Target were, say, sending mailers to people about to buy shoes or toys or a car, but a pregnancy? Pohl says that even if you're following the privacy laws and regulations, you may still trip over ethical lines. Now, British firm Cambridge Analytica gathered data on 87 million Facebook users without their consent via what Facebook later labeled malicious use of its developer system. Any user who took their custom Facebook personality quiz also unknowingly allowed Cambridge Analytica to access their personal data and the personal data including location for all their friends. Clearly, unethical collection. CA then used the data to perform digital operations to target future President Trump's 2016 campaign messaging using, quote, 5,000 points of data on every voter to set the campaign's travel schedule, to platform, and to micro-target Facebook users with $1 million a day in ads. Maybe that's not unethical use, but it was based on unethically collected data. These quotes you see here are from the Cambridge Analytica data analyst Christopher Wiley, turned whistleblower, who testified in both the US and the UK in 2018. Cambridge Analytica later shared Facebook data with Russian proxies for rumor campaigns and, quote, attitudinal inoculation and, quote, psychological warfare. Wiley, when he worked at CA, did not believe their collection and analysis was unethical. He does now. Analysts must be aware of consent mechanisms. both how they were collected and, more logistically, how this data on consent can be incorporated into future analysis. For example, where is it recorded that users signed off on the privacy policy? Where is it recorded that participants asked to be contacted in the future or placed on a do not call list? Are we transparent about our use or potential reuse of this data? Does our approach rely on tricking customers or finding customers that are gullible or influenceable? Let's talk more about that potential reuse of data. Control creep refers to data that has been generated with a particular purpose in mind, but which is then repurposed. Can anyone think of a genetic data example that has been identified as having a disparate impact that is now federally banned in the US for use in hiring? For example, employers in the United States used genetic screenings in the early 1970s to identify potential employees who carried a specific gene mutation for sickle cell anemia, a very expensive and periodically debilitating genetic disorder that is predominant in African Americans. Quote, those carrying the gene mutation were then denied jobs, even though many of them were healthy and would never develop the disease. In the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 put an end to sickle cell trait discrimination in employment. In the UK, the Equality Act of 2010 provided for the same. Here, in the middle of a pandemic, federal law in the United States does not allow employers to require and collect blood tests for COVID-19 antibodies before employers turn to work. But it does allow for a COVID-19 test in the form of a nasal swab to test for an active infection. Similarly, a genetic test for expensive cancers should not be a prerequisite for joining an employer's healthcare coverage. That would be unethical. As personal health data services and devices become more prevalent in our society, let's be wary of potential misuse and reuse and discrimination based on predictive health markers. Using financial data for healthcare research is potentially predatory and discriminatory, and vice versa, where only wealthy patients are told about the best and more expensive treatments. This also leads to a relatively new concept called weblining, or the use of financial data to target users for online ads, including childcare, housing, or healthcare. This is a play on words of redlining, which we'll talk about more soon. Financial data may be predatory if lower income consumers are targeted with subprime lending, high interest credit cards, or high fee banking advertisements. We should be aware and transparent of potential control creep in data that we control.
We'll talk more about weblining later because it can contribute to digitizing and a disparate impact. We mentioned this earlier with the Apple Card algorithm having disparate impact on women and of facial recognition's disparate impact on darker skinned individuals. Most systems, selection systems especially, are built to intend to discriminate, meaning that they create distinctions among people. And let me say that again. Most systems, especially selection systems, hiring systems, are built to intend to discriminate, to create that distinction among people. But there's various laws about discrimination on the basis of age, gender, race. These laws are most notable around employment, housing, public accommodation. In the United States, for example, there are two forms of illegal discrimination. The first is disparate treatment, and that is active discrimination towards particular individuals. It's intentional, it's open bias, retaliation, and it's exclusatory. The second, though, is disparate or adverse impact, and that's more passive discrimination. That's towards groups of individuals. You're sometimes unaware that they even exist in your system. So in the case of housing discrimination, the doctrine of disparate impact recognizes that implicit biases can produce discriminatory results, even without intent, and it allows for such results to be remedied. Analytical models or predictive models must either account for and be aware of past trends or become guilty of continuing and institutionalizing those past trends. Your data analysis must expose and control for disparate impact, or you will contribute to it.
So a brief history of redlining, a term used in the United States and Canada to describe once legal housing segregation. Red lines were literally drawn on maps around undesirable, quote, minority neighborhoods, marking them as undesirable for hazardous and hazardous for financing. This denied federal housing authority insured mortgages to minority families, literally legalized disparate impact by the federal housing authority. Many of you as young people may have used FHA subsidized loans to make your first home purchase. We did. In the 1930s, the FHA surveyed neighborhoods in 239 cities, color coding them green for best, blue for still desirable, yellow for definitely declining, and red for, quote, hazardous. These redlined areas were the ones local lenders considered unsuitable areas for investment because of the residents' racial and ethnic demographics. This is an actual redlining map from 1937 from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Maps like this were used throughout the country. It wasn't until a series of laws in the 1970s that banks were required to meet the lending needs of low-income neighborhoods. The American dream of home ownership was denied to Boomer and Generation X minorities legally throughout the 1970s. And that generational gap continues today, 50 years later. 3 out of 4 neighborhoods redlined on government maps 80 years ago continue to struggle economically. Quote, 50 years after the Federal Fair Housing Act, African Americans and Latinos continue to be routinely denied conventional mortgage loans at rates far higher than their white counterparts. This is a racial dot map of my hometown of Baton Rouge, Louisiana in the United States. It shows racial demographic data from the 2010 US Census. See if you can spot Florida Boulevard on this map, a historical redlining boundary. If you're a bank, your analysis on market segmentation may be furthering historical racial housing segregation if you are ignoring minority areas for special loan rate offers, ATM locations, service locations, assignments, etc. Even if you aren't intending to exclude minorities from your financial services, by ignoring 85 years of racial subdividing, you may be extending a historical trend. If, say, despite your best intentions, your outcome was that 80% of your mortgages were written to whites in a majority black city like Baton Rouge, your bank could only be judged by its outcomes, not by your best intentions.
Go to the next. So only outcomes can measure disparate impact. Disparate impact is not based on intentions. However, in 2019, the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development proposed rules that would make it nearly impossible for banks, landlords, or insurance companies to be sued when minorities are disproportionately denied housing. Companies could blame their algorithm to avoid those penalties. So the proposed rule would overturn 50 years of precedent that were upheld by the Supreme Court in 2015 that permit the use of statistical analysis to identify patterns of discrimination. So we've discussed disparate impact in housing. Now let's discuss more modern online examples. Weblining, or digital redlining, is a segmentation of consumer data based on income. This may result in disparate exposure to online ads and services, like in childcare, housing, or healthcare. Social sorting is the coding and classifying of aggregate data, and social sorting affects both the choices and opportunities of profiled individuals. Facebook, for example, was investigated for allowing housing ads to target based on religion, race, sex, disability, and more. This allowed for obvious housing discrimination, which is already illegal. Another example is a study that was found in discrimination in Google's online ad delivery. Google Ads featured a headline that said, "Have you ever been arrested?" but those were sent more frequently to racially black sounding names than to white sounding names.
Another example of disparate impact is a pretty clear case of a bad outcome of an algorithm. In 2017, thousands of disabled or elderly in the state of Arkansas lost Medicaid funding for life-critical in-home caregivers. Perhaps the cuts were unintentional at first, but they were also unannounced, implemented without caution or review for disparate impact, and then defended by the state for years. Even once, the state was held in contempt by a judge for continuing to use the algorithm. Eventually, the state legislature cut benefits after a lengthy court battle. The algorithm won. This is a cautionary tale that speaks to the lack of due process and oversight, sometimes inherent to an algorithm's decision. If transparency and mitigating bias are our goals, then we must review the outcomes. In another case, 3 different commercial AI products from IBM, Microsoft, Face++ used skewed data samples that overrepresented the pictures of lighter-skinned males and vastly underrepresented and therefore underperformed when trying to identify women or people with darker skin. As a result, the faces of one of the researchers was not even detected, and the task of identifying the genders of African and European Parliament members showed a 1/3 failure rate on a 50-50 task. An FBI co-authored study indicated that facial recognition software is less accurate on darker skin. Similarly, personal voice assistants like Google Home and Amazon's Alexa struggle with black voices.
Nope, she's good.
Speech recognition algorithms disproportionately misunderstand black speakers for the same reasons: poorly sampled source data. So when this type of facial recognition is used in law enforcement and is less accurate on darker skinned citizens, the potential, no, inevitability of a civil rights disaster is high. And in fact, in January 2020, a black man, Robert Williams, was arrested on his front lawn in a suburb of Detroit after police scanned state driver's license photos and matched his grainy surveillance camera footage. He was innocent. In the lawsuit and the media storm surrounding Robert Williams, the Detroit chief of police admitted in June that 96% of the time, the facial recognition software would misidentify suspects. Credit to the Detroit chief of police for that amount of transparency.
So we know what bias is. We know what bias looks like. We know about how bias can create problems for ethical collection and analysis. We know how to look for ethical collection and analysis by understanding disparate impact. And we know that disparate impact does not care about your intentions. So what kind of questions can we ask ourselves and our teams to avoid those ethical pitfalls in our data analysis and our collection? How anonymous is our data? Do we have the citizens' consent, either implicitly or explicitly, for the level of anonymity that we have collected? Who has access to the data internally? Who has access to the data externally? Does the citizen have access? Is that access then revocable? Legally, what's the regulatory environment that the citizen exists in? What are our responsibilities and potential liabilities, such as GDPR in Europe or the California Consumer Privacy Act? And then, is our data trustworthy? And are its biases understood? Do we have enough context to understand the potential outcomes?
When we first presented this topic in May of 2020 at a virtual conference in Europe, we were asked somewhat incredulously if we were in favor of regulation of software development. Frankly, yes. Engineers who make bridges need a regulated licensing because we don't want bridges collapsing. Doctors need board certifications to make sure people get evidence-based medical care. General contractors need a license and a bond to build a house because we don't want houses collapsing for preventable reasons. From the Therac 25 software bug that caused patients in the 1980s to be inadvertently megadosed with radiation, to the Boeing 737 MAX, perhaps we as data professionals, and specifically as software developers generally, we do need some regulation, or at least ethical commitments to practice. So Oren Etzioni, the CEO of the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence and a professor at the University of Washington, has proposed just that, a modified version of a medical doctor's Hippocratic Oath, the oath sworn by generations of doctors to do no harm, etc. He proposed a Hippocratic Oath for artificial intelligence practitioners, which is 11 paragraphs, but at the heart of it, I will consider the impact of my work on fairness, both in perpetuating historical biases, which is caused by the blind extrapolation from past data to future predictions, and in creating new conditions that increase economic or other inequality. Finally, Colin Allen, a researcher in cognitive science and history, said that just as we can envisage machines with increasing degrees of autonomy from human oversight, we can envisage machines whose controls involve increasing degrees of sensitivity to things that matter ethically. Not perfect machines, to be sure, but better. And to summarize the last hour, how can you mitigate bias and perform data analytics ethically? It's very simple. When you know better, do better. And we will pause for any questions.
We don't have any at this time.
All right.
Okay, great. Well, we'll hang out for a few minutes in case anybody thinks of a good one, because we still have some time to spare.
Because there was one that was above that. Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
Thank you all for attending today's session with Christine and William, and thank you for sharing ethics in modern data. The recording of the session will be available at HoustonTechFest.com momentarily. We hope you enjoy the rest of virtual Houston Tech Fest. Have a great day.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.